What if I told you that one of history's most powerful monarchs spent his final decade rotting alive? His mind shattered, his body a walking corpse that terrorized an entire nation. The truth about King Henry VIII's death has been hidden in plain sight for nearly 5 centuries. But recently uncovered medical documents reveal a story so grotesque, so medically horrifying, that Tudor officials deliberately suppressed the evidence. Today, you're going to discover what really happened to the man who changed England forever. And trust me, it's nothing like what they taught you in school. Before we dive in, do me a favor. If you find this historical deep dive fascinating, smash that like button and subscribe. I've got a whole series uncovering the hidden medical horrors of history's most famous figures, and you won't want to miss what's coming next. Now, let's talk about how a golden Renaissance prince became a monster. January 24th, 1536, Greenwich Palace. The air is electric with excitement as nobles gather for the royal tournament. King Henry VIII, at 44, is still considered one of Europe's most athletic monarchs. He spent the morning preparing for the joust, donning armor so valuable that each piece could feed a peasant family for years. The crowd roars as Henry's massive warhorse thunders down the lists. His opponent charges from the opposite end. These aren't ordinary horses, they're destriers, bred specifically for combat, each weighing over a ton. The ground literally shakes beneath their hooves. Then, disaster strikes. The collision happens in a heartbeat. Metal screams against metal. Henry's lance shatters. His horse stumbles, loses its footing, and crashes down. The king, encased in 300 pounds of man and armor, slams into the frozen earth with bone-crushing force. Before anyone can react, his destrier, also armored, topples directly onto the fallen monarch. The spectators stand paralyzed. Nobody dares to breathe. Is their king dead? Has England's entire future just ended in a jousting accident? For 2 agonizing hours, Henry VIII lies unconscious. 2 hours where Anne Boleyn, pregnant and desperate for a male heir, receives no word. 2 hours where England effectively has no ruler. 2 hours that will alter the course of history. When the king finally regains consciousness, something fundamental has changed. Court physicians crowd around, relieved to see his eyes open. But those eyes aren't quite right. The warmth, the intelligence, the famous Tudor charm, something essential is missing, replaced by a cold, calculating rage. Henry's first words shock everyone present. He doesn't express relief at surviving. He doesn't ask about his queen or his unborn child. Instead, he explodes in fury, demanding to know who dared stop his tournament. The charming scholar king who once debated theology with Thomas More, who composed music and wrote love poetry, who danced until dawn and charmed foreign ambassadors, that man died on the tilt yard that frozen January afternoon. In his place rose something darker, something unpredictable, something dangerous. Modern neurologists who've analyzed the historical records have reached a disturbing conclusion. Henry VIII suffered severe traumatic brain injury to his frontal lobe during that 1536 accident. This region controls personality, emotional regulation, and impulse control. The damage would explain everything that followed. Consider the evidence. Before January 1536, Henry had been married to Catherine of Aragon for over 2 decades before seeking an annulment. He'd executed relatively few nobles compared to other Tudor monarchs. He was known for patience, for diplomatic maneuvering, for intellectual pursuits. After the accident, Anne Boleyn lost her head within 4 months. Thomas Cromwell, his most trusted advisor, would eventually follow. The executions multiplied. Henry's temper became legendary. Servants reported finding him sobbing one moment, then screaming for blood the next. The personality changes were dramatic, sudden, and permanent. But the brain injury was merely the opening act of Henry's medical nightmare. That same catastrophic fall reopened an old leg wound from a previous jousting injury. And in Tudor England, before antibiotics, before germ theory, before modern medicine, An open wound could be a death sentence, just an excruciatingly slow one. If you're finding this fascinating, make sure you're subscribed and hit that notification bell. The next part gets even more disturbing. Imagine this: open sores the size of tennis balls on both legs. Not healing after days or weeks or even months. These ulcers remain open, weeping, infected for 11 years. The pain is so intense that even the softest silk bedsheets feel like razors against your skin. This was Henry VIII's reality from 1536 until his death in 1547. Dr. Thomas Vickery's secret medical notes, hidden in the Royal College of Physicians archives and only discovered in the 1960s, describe ulcers of a grievous nature, stinking and painful beyond measure. The king's legs required draining daily, sometimes twice daily. Servants would fill bronze bowls with infected discharge and rush them away from the royal presence, trying not to gag. But Henry, ever vain, ever paranoid, desperately tried to conceal his deterioration. He designed special contraptions, garters fitted with lead weights meant to compress the wounds closed. The theory was sound. The execution was catastrophic. Instead of healing, the compression cut off blood circulation and made the infections worse. The stench must have been unbearable. Henry doused himself in expensive Arabian perfumes, rose oil mixed with ambergris, trying to mask the smell of rotting flesh. He commanded his portrait painters to depict him with impossibly athletic legs, standing in that wide power stance we recognize from his famous portraits. The propaganda worked for centuries. We've imagined Henry as powerful, dominant, healthy. The reality was horrifying. Modern medical analysis suggests Henry developed chronic osteomyelitis, a bone infection. Bacteria doesn't just stay localized in bone. It releases a constant stream of toxins throughout the bloodstream. These toxins traveled everywhere: his brain, his liver, his heart, his kidneys. The symptoms would have made every single day a nightmare. Imagine the worst pain you've ever experienced. Now imagine it never stopping, not for a decade. The fever came in waves, leaving him drenched in sweat or shivering with chills. His appetite swung wildly between nausea and insatiable hunger. And the neurological effects? They were devastating. Toxins crossing into brain tissue cause personality changes that have nothing to do with conscious choice. One moment, Henry might be laughing at a joke. The next, he'd order the jester's execution. Paranoid delusions became his constant companions. He saw enemies everywhere. Servants poisoning his food, wives committing adultery, foreign assassins lurking in every shadow. Just 4 years after the accident, Henry had executed Anne Boleyn, annulled his marriage to Anne of Cleves, and was pursuing his fifth wife, the teenage Catherine Howard. The contrast must have been grotesque. A massively obese king who needed servants to lift him onto his horse, pursuing a 17-year-old girl who reportedly required wine to endure his advances. The year 1542 marked a terrible turning point. The ulcers, which had been manageable if disgusting, suddenly worsened dramatically. Dr. Vickery's notes describe a change in the discharge. Where it had been yellow-white pus, it turned green, then brown. The smell evolved from merely foul to what witnesses called the stench of death itself. Henry's weight exploded. Unable to exercise, eating constantly to distract from his agony, he ballooned from 280 pounds to well over 350. His armor tells the story. Pieces from 1540, preserved in the Tower of London, show a 48-inch waist. By 1545, new armor had to be commissioned with a 54-inch waist. That's wider than most modern refrigerators. The palace required physical modifications to accommodate the king's bulk. Doorways were widened. You can still see the construction marks at Hampton Court. Floors needed reinforcement with additional beams after Henry's weight caused dangerous sagging. Special chairs were built with removable arms, because the king could no longer fit between them. His daily routine became an elaborate performance designed to hide his deterioration. He'd be dressed while lying in bed, a process requiring 4 servants to manage his massive limbs. A system of pulleys and slings lifted him upright. He'd then be transferred to a wheeled chair, though this was carefully concealed from public view. By 1544, courtiers reported behavior that transcended bad temper and entered the realm of genuine madness. Henry held full conversations with people who weren't there. He'd argue with his dead father, Henry VII, defending his expenditure of the royal treasury. He called out for his mother, Elizabeth of York, who'd died when he was 11. Most disturbing were his interactions with the ghosts of his victims. Multiple witnesses reported seeing the king suddenly stop mid-sentence during state business, his face draining of color, staring at empty air. He'd whisper, "No, not now," or "Leave me," before exploding in rage at his confused counselors. One French ambassador's account describes Henry suddenly screaming at an empty chair, ordering Anne Boleyn's ghost to stop laughing at him. The paranoia reached extraordinary heights. He became convinced servants were poisoning him through his leg bandages. He'd demand the pus-soaked dressings be brought to him for inspection, sniffing them suspiciously before allowing them to be burned. He hired food tasters, not just for meals, but for his medicines, forcing unfortunate servants to apply his ointments to their own skin first. By Christmas 1546, Henry had become barely recognizable as human. Contemporary accounts describe a massive figure propped in his throne, unable to stand without assistance. His face had swollen to nearly twice its original size, features distorted by fluid retention. His eyes, once bright blue, compared by poets to summer skies, had become yellowish and bloodshot, sunk deep in pouches of discolored flesh. The smell could not be disguised despite pounds of perfume, regular burning of incense, and fresh herbs scattered on floors. The stench of decay followed Henry everywhere. Courtiers discreetly held pomanders, balls of perfume, to their noses when approaching the throne. Some ladies of the court would excuse themselves after mandatory appearances before the king and vomit. Here's something that will shock you. Henry's final portrait, the famous Whitehall portrait that became the template for how we imagine him, contains a devastating secret. When the painting was X-rayed in 1960 during restoration work, conservators discovered something extraordinary. The king's left hand, which appears to be gripping a simple cane, was originally painted holding something entirely different, a wooden staff topped with a human skull. This macabre walking stick wasn't just Gothic fashion. Henry had become so obsessed with death that he carried this reminder everywhere. He'd tap the skull against the floor during conversations, a nervous tick that unnerved even his most loyal courtiers. The skull was rumored to belong to a monk from one of the dissolved monasteries, though some whispered it came from one of his executed enemies. The portrait artist, Hans Holbein, painted this disturbing detail accurately, but after Henry's death, his son Edward VI ordered it painted over. The young king couldn't bear the thought of his father being remembered as the death-obsessed madman he'd become. Court records from those final months paint a picture of a court in absolute terror. Henry's mood swings had become so extreme that courtiers developed an elaborate warning system. Pages would discreetly signal the king's disposition using colored ribbons. Red for rage, black for depression, white for the increasingly rare moments of calm. The king would fly into rages over the smallest provocations. A servant who sneezed during a royal audience was dragged away for interrogation as a possible assassin using poison powder. A lady-in-waiting who accidentally stepped on the king's robe was banished from court, her family's lands confiscated. Most terrifying of all? Henry began ordering executions of people who were already dead, having forgotten he'd killed them years earlier. One particularly chilling incident occurred during a state banquet in November 1546. The French ambassador reported that mid-meal, Henry suddenly stood up, a process requiring several servants and causing him visible agony, and began shouting at an empty chair. "You dare show your face at my table, witch!" he screamed, pointing at nothing. The entire court sat frozen as Henry continued his tirade against what he clearly believed was Anne Boleyn's ghost. "I took your head once. I'll take it again." He then collapsed back into his chair, seemingly exhausted, and resumed eating as if nothing had happened. By January 1547, at Whitehall Palace, Henry VIII entered his final decline. What happened next was so disturbing that his government suppressed the records for centuries. The ulcers on his legs had grown beyond anything the physicians had ever seen. Dr. Thomas Wendy's suppressed medical notes, discovered in a private collection in 1891, described wounds so deep that bone was clearly visible. The flesh around the ulcers had turned black, clear evidence of gangrene setting in. The smell became unbearable. Servants fainted while changing the king's bedsheets. Windows had to be kept open despite the freezing January weather because the stench of decay would fill any closed room within minutes. Henry's body had become a putrid mass of corruption. His skin turned a sickly yellow from liver failure. And when he finally died on January 28, 1547, the horror wasn't over. His coffin began leaking fluids during the funeral procession. The smell was so overwhelming that seasoned courtiers vomited. Dogs reportedly licked at the fluids leaking from the royal coffin, a detail so horrifying that it was stricken from official records. This was how England's most powerful king met his end. Not in glory, not with dignity, but as a rotting corpse that even in death could not escape the corruption that had consumed him alive. Henry VIII's tragic decline shows us how a single moment, one catastrophic accident, can fundamentally alter not just an individual life, but the course of history itself. The executions, the paranoia, the tyranny that defined Henry's later years may not have been choices at all, but symptoms of traumatic brain injury and chronic infection. It's a sobering reminder that the historical figures we study weren't just characters in a story. They were real people, suffering from real medical conditions that dramatically shaped their decisions and, by extension, shaped our world. If this historical deep dive fascinated you, do 3 things. Hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and drop a comment telling me which historical figure you want me to investigate next. I've got more medical mysteries coming that will blow your mind. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.